Dr. Randall Ashcroft said it in front of the entire disaster response team, his voice carrying easily over the chaos of the hospital's command center. "She's just a nurse. Get her out of this briefing, and get me someone who actually understands incident command." 11 minutes later, a Navy Rear Admiral would walk into that same command center, take one look at the woman Ashcroft had just ordered removed, and ask her to take command of the entire hospital's disaster response. Her name was Maya Bristol, and she had spent the last 6 years of her life becoming exactly the kind of person nobody in that room, except possibly herself, understood she already was. Maya Bristol was 34 years old, 5'8". With straight, jet-black hair she kept cut to her jawline in a severe, no-nonsense bob that required minimal maintenance and never once got in her way during a shift. Her eyes were a deep, near-black brown, steady and unblinking in a way that unsettled people who expected nurses, even experienced ones, to show at least some visible strain during a crisis. She moved through emergencies with an economy of motion that had, over 3 years at Harborview Regional Medical Center, become quietly legendary among the nursing staff, even if nobody could quite articulate where that competence had actually come from. She had been hired at Harborview 3 years earlier, coming from what her employment file described only as prior clinical experience in a specialized capacity, a phrase vague enough that the hiring committee had simply assumed it referred to some kind of unconventional but legitimate civilian trauma background. Nobody had pushed for specifics, and Maya had never volunteered them, because the specifics belonged to a chapter of her life she had spent considerable effort learning how to leave behind without erasing it entirely. What her file did not say, what almost nobody at Harborview knew, was that Maya Bristol had spent 9 years as a Navy officer, the final 5 as a medical operations coordinator for Naval Special Warfare, working directly alongside SEAL teams in planning, training, and combat deployment cycles across multiple theaters. She had held the rank of lieutenant commander at the time of her separation from active duty, a rank earned through a combination of exceptional field performance and a specific, rare talent for coordinating complex medical logistics under conditions that would overwhelm most experienced trauma coordinators within minutes. She had left the Navy 18 months earlier, not from any single catastrophic event, but from the accumulated, grinding weight of 9 years spent making decisions that carried genuinely mortal consequences, decisions she had made well, consistently, but that had cost her something she could no longer fully articulate even to herself. She had wanted, more than anything, a version of medicine where the stakes, while still real, didn't carry quite the same operational and geopolitical weight she'd spent nearly a decade shouldering. Her civilian life, in the 18 months before the hurricane, had settled into a specific, carefully constructed rhythm. She lived alone in a small apartment near the water, deliberately chosen for its distance from anything resembling the operational tempo of her old life. She ran along the shoreline most mornings before her shifts, not for fitness exactly, though it kept her in the same disciplined physical condition she'd maintained throughout her Navy years, but because the specific, repetitive rhythm of it was one of the few things that reliably quieted the particular restlessness that still occasionally found her in unguarded moments. Restlessness that had nothing to do with her current life and everything to do with a version of herself she was still, 18 months later, learning how to carry forward without letting it define every subsequent choice. She kept her personal life deliberately small. She had cultivated a handful of genuine but carefully bounded friendships among the Harborview staff, close enough for ordinary warmth, but never close enough to require the kind of full disclosure that would have unraveled the careful vagueness she maintained about her history. She had told herself, over those 18 months, that this careful smallness was simply prudent, a reasonable accommodation to the specific classification restrictions that governed most details of her former career. She had not fully examined, until the hurricane forced the issue, how much of that smallness was actually more about her own comfort than about any genuine operational necessity. She had found that version at Harborview. She had not expected it to survive very long, past the morning a Category 4 hurricane made unexpected landfall along the coast, sending a mass casualty wave toward her hospital that would, within 6 hours, reveal every carefully hidden truth about who she actually was. Dr. Randall Ashcroft was 56 years old, Harborview's chief of emergency medicine, and the hospital's designated incident commander for exactly this kind of disaster scenario, a position he had held for 11 years, defended fiercely, and approached with the particular rigid, hierarchical certainty of a man who believed disaster response was fundamentally about the correct people making decisions in the correct order, with very little tolerance for input from anyone he considered below that correct order. He had built Harborview's disaster response protocols largely in his own image over more than a decade, and he ran incident command briefings with the specific controlling precision of someone who had never seriously questioned whether his approach to command actually worked as well in practice as it did on paper. He did not like being challenged. He especially did not like being challenged by nursing staff during a briefing, and he had, over Maya's 3 years at Harborview, developed a low-grade but persistent irritation toward her specifically, not because she was incompetent, which even he couldn't credibly claim, but because she had a habit, in high-pressure situations, of offering logistics assessments with a confidence and precision that made him feel, in some part of himself he rarely examined too closely, quietly threatened. Part of that reflex traced back to the specific circumstances of his own rise to the position he now occupied. He had built his authority over 11 years through a combination of genuine clinical skill and a specific, careful cultivation of institutional deference, learning early in his tenure that the fastest way to secure his position within Harborview's hierarchy was to project unwavering, unquestionable certainty, even in moments where genuine uncertainty might have been the more honest and ultimately more useful response. He had, over the years, internalized that performance of certainty so thoroughly that he had largely stopped distinguishing it from actual conviction, and any input that threatened to expose the gap between the two triggered a defensive response he rarely examined closely enough to recognize for what it actually was. The hurricane had made landfall 6 hours earlier than the latest forecast models had predicted, catching the region's emergency services in the specific, dangerous gap between preparation and full readiness. Harborview's disaster response plan activated at 4:15 that morning, and by 6:30, the hospital's command center, a converted conference room adjacent to the ER, filled with department heads, security staff, and a hastily assembled coordination team, was working through the early, chaotic hours of what was rapidly becoming the largest mass casualty event the hospital had faced in over a decade. Outside, the storm's outer bands had already begun lashing the coastline with a violence that exceeded even the revised forecast, rain moving nearly horizontal against the hospital's windows, the specific howling intensity of wind speeds that emergency broadcasts were now describing in increasingly urgent terms. Inside, the command center's controlled chaos carried its own specific tension, phones ringing continuously, staff moving between whiteboards updating casualty projections, the particular charged atmosphere of an institution beginning to understand, in real time, that the scale of what was coming exceeded what anyone had adequately prepared for. Maya had been pulled into the command center not by any deliberate strategic decision, but because she happened to be the charge nurse on duty when the disaster protocol activated, and charge nurses were, under Harborview's standard procedures, included in initial incident command briefings as a matter of course. She should not, by any reasonable measure, have been a particularly notable presence in that room. She was there in exactly the role her position required, offering the same kind of situational input any competent charge nurse might offer. What made her presence remarkable, though almost nobody in the room yet understood why, was the specific, unnerving clarity and speed with which she began identifying gaps and inefficiencies in Ashcroft's response plan. Gaps that a career emergency physician, however experienced, had simply never been trained to see with the particular operational lens Maya brought to the problem. "We're going to run out of surge capacity in the ER within 90 minutes if we don't establish a secondary triage point now," Maya said, 20 minutes into the briefing, her voice cutting cleanly through the layered noise of 6 simultaneous conversations. "The current plan routes everything through a single choke point. That's going to create a bottleneck exactly when we can least afford one." Ashcroft, mid-sentence in his own assessment, turned to look at her with an expression that mixed irritation with the specific, dismissive impatience of a man unaccustomed to interruption from someone he considered several rungs beneath him in the room's actual hierarchy. "We have a protocol for this," he said. "It's been tested. It works." "It works for a standard mass casualty event," Maya said. "This isn't standard. We're looking at a combined trauma and environmental exposure surge, with secondary flooding risk to the lower-level triage areas within the next 2 hours, based on the current storm surge projections. The protocol wasn't built for this specific combination of variables." "And you know this how exactly?" Ashcroft asked, his voice sharpening. "Because you've run disaster response for a hospital before? Because in the 11 years I've been managing incident command at this facility, I don't recall your name attached to a single command decision." The room went quiet, the specific, uncomfortable silence of colleagues watching a public correction unfold in real time. "I have relevant experience," Maya said, carefully, without elaborating further. "I'm telling you what the data's showing, not asserting authority I don't have." "You're a nurse," Ashcroft said, each word deliberate, carrying the accumulated weight of years of quiet, unexamined certainty about the natural hierarchy of a hospital's chain of command. "A good one, I'll grant you. But incident command in a disaster of this scale requires strategic experience you simply don't have. This isn't the moment for confidence to outrun credentials." He turned to the room's coordinator. "Get her back to the ER floor. I need people in this briefing who actually understand large-scale incident command, not just good instincts." Maya absorbed the dismissal with the same flat, controlled composure she brought to everything, no visible reaction beyond a slight, almost imperceptible stillness settling over her posture. The specific discipline of someone who had been trained, a long time ago, not to let public correction disrupt the actual work in front of her. "Understood, Doctor," she said, and rose to leave the command center, unaware that in exactly 11 minutes, a Navy Rear Admiral would walk through that same door, take one look at her, and completely upend everything Randall Ashcroft believed about who belonged in that room. Rear Admiral Frank Delacroix arrived at Harborview Regional at 7:03 a.m., not because of any connection to the hurricane response itself, but because a joint military and civilian coordination protocol had activated the moment the storm's severity exceeded Regional Emergency Services' independent capacity. A protocol that placed several senior military logistics officers, including Delacroix, in direct coordination with the largest civilian hospitals along the affected coastline, to help manage the surge of military and civilian casualties. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, compact and precise in his movements, with the specific bearing of a man who had spent nearly 4 decades learning to read a room's actual competence within seconds of entering it. He walked into Harborview's command center expecting, based on years of similar coordination efforts with civilian facilities, to find a reasonably competent but likely overwhelmed incident command structure in need of considerable outside support. Delacroix had commanded Maya during the final 3 years of her active duty service, and had, in that time, developed a particular professional respect for her that extended well beyond the ordinary chain of command relationship. a respect built on repeated, direct observation of her performance under exactly the kind of extreme conditions that separated genuinely exceptional coordinators from merely competent ones. He had approved her separation request with real reluctance, understanding even then the specific caliber of expertise the Navy was losing, but had also recognized, watching her carefully through the final months of her service, that she had reached a point where continuing to shoulder that particular weight was no longer sustainable, whatever the institutional cost of losing her. He had not pushed her to reconsider. He had, instead, simply told her that the door would remain open if circumstances ever changed, and had spent the 18 months since quietly, periodically wondering whether she had found the peace she'd been seeking. What he found instead, in his first 90 seconds inside that room, was a level of organizational confusion that concerned him considerably more than he'd anticipated. An incident commander working from a protocol that clearly hadn't adapted to the specific combined threat profile of the storm. A surge capacity plan with an obvious bottleneck that nobody in the room seemed to be actively addressing, and a general atmosphere of controlled but genuine strain that told him, within moments, that this response was operating considerably closer to the edge of failure than anyone in the room seemed to fully appreciate. "Who's running incident command here?" Delacroix asked, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who didn't need to raise it to command a room's attention. "I am," Ashcroft said, straightening. "Dr. Randall Ashcroft, Chief of Emergency Medicine. Admiral, we appreciate the coordination support, but I want to assure you we have this well in hand." Delacroix studied the room for another long moment, his gaze moving across the scattered whiteboards, the visibly strained coordination staff, the specific chaos of a command structure managing far more variables than its current framework was built to handle. "I don't think you do, Doctor," he said, not unkindly, but with a directness that left no room for polite disagreement. "You've got a surge bottleneck forming at your primary triage point, no clear secondary triage established, and based on what I'm seeing on that storm surge model on your wall, you've got roughly 90 minutes before your lower-level triage areas become genuinely unsafe. Who identified that risk profile? Because someone in this building clearly did, given that map's already been marked up." Ashcroft's expression flickered, a brief, uncomfortable hesitation. "One of our nursing staff raised the concern," he said. "I've noted it. We're working through appropriate channels." "Where is she now?" Delacroix asked. "I sent her back to the floor," Ashcroft said. "This briefing requires personnel with strategic incident command experience, and while her instincts are clearly sharp, she doesn't have—" "Get her back in this room," Delacroix said, cutting him off with the flat, absolute authority of someone who had stopped listening to the rest of that sentence the moment its direction became clear. "Now, please." Maya was located within minutes, still on the ER floor coordinating patient flow with the same steady focus she brought to everything, and she returned to the command center uncertain what she was walking back into, her expression carefully neutral as she stepped through the door. Rear Admiral Frank Delacroix looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, and something in his face shifted from professional assessment into genuine, startled recognition. "Lieutenant Commander Bristol," he said. The command center went completely silent. "Admiral," Maya said, and something in her controlled composure wavered, briefly, genuine surprise passing across her face at being recognized in a room she'd never expected her old life to intersect with. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to find you here either," Delacroix said. "Though given everything I know about you, I probably should have guessed you'd land somewhere exactly like this." He glanced around the room, taking in the confused, uncertain expressions of the staff who had just watched him address a nurse with a rank none of them recognized. "You're the one who flagged the surge bottleneck and the storm surge timeline on that map." "I am," Maya said. "Of course you are," Delacroix said, something almost like relief moving through his voice. He turned to Ashcroft, who was standing several feet away, processing the exchange with an expression of dawning, disbelieving confusion. "Doctor, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer, rather than a defensive one. How long have you had a Naval Special Warfare Medical Operations Coordinator on your nursing staff, and how much of her operational planning experience have you actually been utilizing before this morning?" Ashcroft opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. She's been here 3 years. As a nurse. I wasn't aware of any additional. She spent 5 years coordinating medical logistics for SEAL team deployments across multiple simultaneous theaters, Delacroix said, his voice carrying the flat, matter-of-fact weight of a man stating something he considered simply, obviously true. She has run incident command for mass casualty scenarios in combat conditions that make this hurricane look, with respect to the genuine severity of what you're facing, considerably more survivable than what she's used to managing. If she identified a bottleneck in your surge plan, Doctor, I would take that assessment considerably more seriously than whatever protocol you've been running for the last 11 years, however well tested it's been against ordinary disasters. The room absorbed this in the particular silence of people recalibrating everything they'd assumed about a colleague in the space of a single conversation. "Admiral," Ashcroft said, his earlier certainty visibly cracking. I wasn't aware." "I understand you weren't," Delacroix said, not unkindly, though there was an unmistakable edge beneath the words. "That's precisely the problem I'm here to fix." He turned to Maya. "Lieutenant Commander, I know you separated from active duty, and I know that decision was entirely your own, made for reasons I respect, and won't ask you to revisit today. But I have a hospital facing a mass casualty surge with an incident command structure that's already showing critical gaps 90 minutes into a response that's going to run for days. I'm asking you, not ordering you, because you no longer answer to my orders. I'm asking you to take over incident command for this response. Today, however long it takes to get this hospital and the surrounding region through the worst of this storm." The room went very still. Maya looked at Delacroix for a long moment, then at Ashcroft, whose expression had moved from confusion into something considerably more complicated. The specific, disorienting collapse of a man watching every assumption he'd built about a colleague crumble in real time, in front of his entire team, exactly 90 minutes after he'd publicly dismissed her competence to be in the room at all. "I'd need full authority," Maya said finally, her voice carrying none of the earlier hesitation, settling instead into the flat, precise register of someone who had run exactly this kind of high-stakes coordination more times than she could accurately count. "Not advisory input, actual command authority over resource allocation, triage protocol, and staff assignment, with Dr. Ashcroft's clinical expertise integrated into the command structure rather than sitting above it." "You'll have it," Delacroix said. "I'll make the authorization explicit to hospital administration myself right now if that's what it takes to make the transition clean." Maya turned to look at Ashcroft directly. "Doctor," she said, "I need your clinical judgment in this room, genuinely, not as a formality. I'm not trying to replace your medical expertise. I'm trying to build a command structure that actually accounts for every variable this storm's about to throw at us, and I can't do that without you. But I need you to trust the plan, even when it comes from someone whose credentials looked 90 minutes ago like they didn't belong in this room." Ashcroft stood frozen for a long moment, the entire weight of the morning's events compressing into something he was only now beginning to fully absorb. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice smaller than anyone in that room had likely ever heard it. "I don't think this is the moment for it, but I owe you one." "You do," Maya said. "We'll have that conversation properly, later, once this crisis is actually handled. Right now, I need your help building a surge plan that's going to hold for the next 72 hours. Can I count on that?" "Yes," Ashcroft said, and for the first time in 11 years of running incident command at Harborview, He said it without any trace of his old defensive certainty. Whatever you need. What followed over the next several hours was, for nearly everyone in Harborview's command center, unlike anything they had previously experienced in a hospital setting. Maya restructured the incident command framework with a speed and clarity that left even Delacroix, who had watched her operate under considerably higher stakes conditions years earlier, quietly impressed, establishing a secondary triage point in the hospital's upper-level conference wing before the storm surge model's 90-minute window had even fully elapsed, reorganizing staff assignments to eliminate the bottleneck she'd identified, and building a resource allocation system that accounted for variables the original protocol had never considered. She moved through the command center with the same flat, controlled economy of motion that had characterized her nursing work for 3 years, except now, freed from the specific constraint of operating below her actual capability, that economy of motion revealed itself as something considerably larger, the specific, trained competence of someone who had spent years coordinating exactly this kind of complex, high-stakes logistics under conditions that made a hurricane, however genuinely dangerous, feel within the range of problems she'd trained her entire adult life to solve. "Ashcroft," she said, 40 minutes into her restructured command, "I need your surgical teams reorganized into 2 rotating shifts instead of the standard single team. We're going to be running sustained operations for at least 48 hours, and I'd rather have your best people rested and sharp in 12-hour intervals than exhausted and making mistakes by hour 30. "That's not how we usually structure surgical coverage during a crisis," Ashcroft said, though the objection carried none of his earlier defensive edge, more genuine clinical concern than territorial resistance. "I understand," Maya said, "but usually assumes a crisis that resolves within the first 12 hours. This one won't. I need you to trust the reasoning, not the precedent." Ashcroft considered this for a moment, and then, in a gesture that would have seemed impossible to imagine 90 minutes earlier, nodded. "I'll restructure it," he said. "You're right. I hadn't fully accounted for the sustained timeline." It was, in its own small way, the first genuine moment of collaborative trust between them, and it would not be the last over the following hours, as Maya's restructured command framework proved itself, repeatedly, against a storm that continued to escalate well past the initial forecasts, sending waves of casualties toward Harborview that the hospital's original protocol would almost certainly have failed to absorb without catastrophic strain on both staff and patients. Delacroix found a quiet moment with Maya nearly 4 hours into the response, during a brief lull between casualty waves, and pulled her aside into a corner of the command center with the specific, careful deliberateness of a man who had something considerably more personal than operational business to discuss. Around them, the command center continued its restructured rhythm, staff moving between stations with a purposeful efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the confused scramble he'd walked into just hours earlier. "You look good," he said. "Considering everything, I wasn't sure, honestly, what I'd find when your name came up on that roster." "I'm doing all right," Maya said. "Better than I expected to be, most days, though today's testing that a little." "I read the separation paperwork when it came through," Delacroix said. "I didn't push for details because I understood you needed the space to leave quietly. But I want you to know I've thought about you more than the paperwork probably suggested I was allowed to. You were one of the best coordinators I ever worked with, Bristol. Losing you from the service felt like a genuine loss, whatever the reasons behind it." Maya was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to say, the way she weighed most things. "The reasons were mine," she said finally. 9 years of carrying decisions that cost people their lives, even when I made every one of those decisions as well as they could possibly have been made. I needed to find a version of this work where the stakes, while still real, didn't carry quite the same weight. "Did you find it?" Delacroix asked. "Here, I mean, before today upended the careful anonymity you'd apparently built." Maya considered the question honestly. "Mostly," she said. I found real satisfaction in the work, in the actual patient care, in a way that felt lighter than what I'd carried before. Today's different. Today feels like the old weight, back in full, and I won't pretend that's entirely comfortable. You're handling it better than comfortable would suggest, Delacroix said. I've watched you build a functioning command structure out of genuine chaos in under an hour. That's not luck, and it's not just old training reasserting itself. That's exactly who you've always been, Bristol, whether you're wearing a uniform or not. Maya allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression of relief she'd permitted herself since Ashcroft's public dismissal that morning. Thank you for saying that, she said. I needed to hear it today, more than I probably let on. I mean every word, Delacroix said. And for what it's worth, I don't think this is going to stay quiet after today. Not after what Ashcroft and half this command center just watched. I think you should prepare yourself for that, whatever your feelings about it. I've made my peace with it, Maya said. Somewhere around the surge bottleneck calculation, I stopped worrying about staying quiet and started just doing the work. I think that's probably the only way through today, honestly. The storm's severity peaked at 2:40 that afternoon, sending a final, catastrophic surge of casualties toward Harborview that tested every element of Maya's restructured command framework simultaneously. A partial roof collapse at a coastal shelter that sent 19 critically injured patients toward the hospital within a single 20-minute window, arriving just as the secondary triage point Maya had established reached its own capacity limits. Maya coordinated the response from the command center with the same controlled, unwavering focus she'd maintained through the entire day. But the specific scale of this particular surge pushed even her carefully restructured system toward its outer limits, requiring decisions made in real time with imperfect information and genuinely difficult trade-offs about resource allocation that no protocol, however well designed, could fully anticipate. We're going to need to make some hard calls on OR prioritization, she said to Ashcroft, both of them now working in close, genuine coordination rather than the earlier friction that had characterized their relationship. I've got 3 critical patients who all need immediate surgical intervention and only 2 available ORs for the next 40 minutes. Talk me through what you're seeing, Ashcroft said, and the request carried none of his old reflexive need to assert independent authority, simply genuine collaborative urgency. Maya walked him through the triage assessment with fast, precise clarity. Injury severity scores, projected surgical timelines, the specific, brutal calculus of resource-limited mass casualty triage that she had performed more times than she could accurately count in circumstances considerably more austere than a well-equipped civilian hospital during a hurricane. Ashcroft listened, asked 2 sharp, clarifying questions about one patient's specific presentation, and then, rather than simply deferring to her assessment or reflexively overriding it, offered a genuine clinical insight she hadn't fully weighted, a detail about one patient's cardiac history that shifted the calculus meaningfully. That changes the sequencing, Maya said, immediately incorporating the new information. Good catch. That's exactly the kind of clinical detail I need from you in this process. It was, in its own quiet way, the moment their working relationship fully transformed, not through any dramatic reconciliation, but through the simple, practical experience of genuinely needing each other's different expertise in real time, under pressure, with lives depending on the collaboration actually working. The 19 patients from the shelter collapse were stabilized and appropriately triaged within the following 90 minutes, a result that both Delacroix and the hospital's own administration would later describe, in various formal reviews of the day's events, as considerably better than what the original incident command structure would likely have achieved under the same conditions. That evening, once the storm's worst had passed and the immediate crisis had settled into the more sustainable, longer-term work of managing an extended recovery period, Maya found a few minutes alone in a quiet corner of the command center and allowed herself, for the first time all day, to think properly about the mission that had, 18 months earlier, finally convinced her she needed to leave active duty. It had not been a single catastrophic failure. It had been the accumulated weight of 5 years spent coordinating medical logistics for operations, where the margin for error measured in human lives was narrower than almost any civilian could fully comprehend. 5 years of building contingency plans that accounted for casualties before they happened, of making resource allocation decisions that determined, with brutal directness, which wounded operators received immediate extraction and which had to wait, sometimes fatally, for a window that might not come in time. The specific mission that had broken something in her had involved a compound assault that went wrong in exactly the way military planners spent years trying to prevent and never fully could. A breach that cost 2 operators their lives, despite Maya's medical evacuation plan functioning exactly as designed, because the plan itself had been built around assumptions that the specific tactical failure had violated in ways nobody could have reasonably anticipated. She had not made an error. The after-action review had confirmed that clearly, repeatedly, with the specific institutional thoroughness reserved for exactly this kind of scrutiny. But she had carried, in the months following that mission, an exhaustion that went beyond grief into something closer to a fundamental questioning of whether she could keep making decisions at that scale, with those stakes, for the remainder of a career that might easily span another 15 or 20 years. She had requested separation 4 months after that mission, not from any single moment of clarity, but from the slow, accumulated realization that she needed, more than anything else, a version of medicine where the geometry of consequence felt survivable, in a way 5 years of naval special warfare coordination no longer did. Today had tested that choice more directly than anything had in 18 months of careful civilian anonymity. She found, sitting quietly in the command center's corner, that she did not regret either decision, not the years she'd spent doing work that mattered enormously, nor the choice to eventually leave it for something quieter. Both had been true and necessary versions of who she was, at different points in her life, and today had simply, unexpectedly, asked her to be both versions at once. 3 days after the storm's peak, once Harborview's operations had stabilized into a manageable, sustained recovery rhythm, hospital administration convened a formal review of the disaster response, a meeting that, given the scale of what had happened, drew considerably more attendance than such reviews typically generated, filling the same conference room that had served as the command center throughout the crisis. Rear Admiral Delacroix attended, along with hospital leadership, department heads, and a considerable portion of the staff who had worked directly under Maya's restructured command over the preceding 72 hours. Randall Ashcroft sat near the front this time, rather than his earlier position of unquestioned authority at the head of the table, his posture carrying the specific alertness of a man who understood, correctly, that this meeting concerned him directly. The hospital's CEO, a measured woman named Dr. Constance Vega Whitfield, who had spent the crisis largely coordinating with regional emergency management from an adjacent office, opened the meeting by acknowledging what had, by that point, become common knowledge throughout the hospital, that Maya Bristol, a staff nurse for 3 years, had spent the disaster's most critical 72 hours running incident command with a level of skill that had almost certainly prevented considerably worse outcomes than the hospital ultimately experienced. "I want to be direct about something," Dr. Vega Whitfield said, before we move into the formal after-action review. 3 days ago, in this same room, a member of our staff was told, in front of colleagues, that she was just a nurse, and dismissed from a command briefing where her assessment turned out to be not only correct, but critical to preventing a considerably more severe outcome for this hospital. I think that moment deserves acknowledgement before anything else we discuss today. Ashcroft rose from his seat before anyone else could speak. "I'd like to address that directly," he said, "if the room will allow me." Dr. Vega Whitfield nodded, stepping back to give him the floor. 3 days ago, Ashcroft said, I dismissed a colleague's operational assessment because her formal title didn't match my assumptions about who was qualified to make that kind of assessment. I did this despite the fact that her analysis was, in every particular, correct, and despite the fact that I had 11 years of experience running incident command and had never once, in that entire span, faced a scenario that fully tested whether my protocols could actually hold under genuinely extreme conditions. He paused, and something in his usually confident bearing had visibly, permanently shifted. I have spent considerable time over the last 3 days trying to understand why my certainty was so immediate, so absolute in that moment. I think the honest answer is that I had built an entire professional identity around the assumption that credentials and formal title were the only reliable indicators of competence, and Maya Bristol's employment history didn't fit the story I'd already decided to tell myself about her capabilities. He turned to look at Maya directly. You spent 3 years at this hospital demonstrating exactly the kind of judgment I dismissed in a single sentence, in front of our entire command staff, at the worst possible moment for that dismissal to matter. I don't have an adequate way to apologize for that. I know now that if you hadn't returned to that room, if Admiral Delacroix hadn't insisted on it, this hospital would very likely have faced outcomes considerably worse than what we actually experienced. I owe you more than words for that, but words are what I have right now, and I wanted to offer them properly, in front of everyone who witnessed the original mistake. Maya studied him for a long moment, the same careful, weighing assessment she brought to most difficult judgments. I appreciate you saying that, she said finally. In front of everyone, the way the original mistake happened. That matters. She paused. I'm not interested in punishing you for one bad moment under pressure, Doctor. I'm interested in whether this changes how you approach the next person whose credentials don't match your first assumption about their competence. That's the part that actually matters going forward. I understand, Ashcroft said. I'm going to try to earn a different answer to that question than the one I gave 3 days ago. That's all I'm asking, Maya said. Rear Admiral Delacroix stood next, addressing the room with the specific, formal weight of an officer delivering an official record rather than a personal reflection. I want to make sure this room understands exactly who has been on your nursing staff for the last 3 years, he said. Lieutenant Commander Maya Bristol spent 9 years as a Navy officer, the final 5 as a medical operations coordinator for Naval Special Warfare, working directly with SEAL teams across multiple simultaneous combat theaters. She built medical evacuation and casualty management protocols that are still, to this day, used as training material for incoming coordination officers. She managed logistics for operations, where the margin of error, measured in human lives, was narrower than nearly anyone in this room has ever had to operate within. He paused, letting that settle. 3 days ago, she restructured this hospital's entire incident command framework within roughly 90 minutes, under active crisis conditions, and that restructured framework held for 72 consecutive hours against a storm that exceeded every forecast model's projections. I have coordinated disaster response with dozens of civilian hospitals over the course of my career. I have rarely, if ever, seen a response managed with the level of skill Lieutenant Commander Bristol demonstrated here, under conditions that would have overwhelmed most experienced military coordinators, let alone a civilian hospital's standard leadership structure. The room absorbed this in the particular silence of people confronting the true scale of a colleague's history for the first time. I'm not here to formally discipline anyone, Delacroix continued. That's not my role in this civilian institution, and Lieutenant Commander Bristol has specifically asked that this remain informational rather than punitive. But I am here to make a formal recommendation to this hospital's leadership that Maya Bristol be given a permanent role in this hospital's disaster response planning, with actual authority commensurate with her demonstrated expertise, rather than being treated, going forward, as simply a nurse whose competence only becomes visible during an actual crisis. Dr. Vega Whitfield nodded slowly, absorbing this with the specific gravity of an administrator recalculating an enormous amount of institutional oversight in real time. "I think that recommendation is not only reasonable, but overdue," she said. "We'll be formalizing a new role for you, Miss Bristol, or should I say, Lieutenant Commander, effective immediately, with full authority over disaster response planning and coordination going forward. I hope that's something you'd be willing to accept." Maya considered this for a long moment, weighing the specific, complicated calculus of a life she'd spent 18 months carefully building around not needing this kind of formal recognition. "I'll accept it," she said finally, "on one condition. I want the role to include direct authority to build training programs for the rest of the nursing and support staff, not just planning in isolation, but actually teaching other people some of what I know, so the next disaster doesn't depend entirely on whether I happen to be in the building when it hits." "Done," Dr. Vega Whitfield said. "I think that condition improves the proposal considerably." Delacroix, watching the exchange with the particular satisfaction of someone seeing an institution correct itself in real time, allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "That's very like you, Bristol," he said, "never quite willing to let recognition be about you alone, always finding a way to make it about building something that outlasts the moment. That's the only kind of recognition that's ever actually mattered to me," Maya said. The following weeks brought Maya into an unexpected, entirely new dimension of her work at Harborview. Formal disaster response planning sessions, training program development, and a steady stream of staff, from nursing assistants to senior physicians, seeking her input on operational questions they would never have thought to direct toward her 3 weeks earlier. Among the staff who sought her out most consistently was a second-year nurse named Elena Vasquez, sharp and eager but visibly uncertain of her own judgment in high-pressure situations, having entered the profession only 18 months earlier after a considerably less conventional path than most of her nursing school cohort. Elena had come to nursing relatively late, after several years working as an EMT that had given her a solid foundation in acute emergency response, but had left her, in her own assessment, less confident about the specific judgment calls required in a hospital's more sustained, complex care environment. She had watched Maya's transformation from ordinary staff nurse into disaster response coordinator, with a specific, close attention that went beyond simple professional curiosity, recognizing in Maya's story something she hoped might eventually apply to her own developing confidence. "I froze during the shelter collapse surge," Elena admitted to Maya, during one of their early training sessions, her voice carrying the specific vulnerability of someone confessing something she'd been quietly ashamed of for weeks. "Just for a few seconds. But I froze, while you were coordinating 3 critical patients into 2 ORs without a single wasted movement. I don't know if I actually have what it takes for this kind of work." Maya considered the confession with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. "Everyone freezes. The first time the stakes are genuinely that high," she said. "I froze too. The first time I was in a comparably extreme situation. What matters isn't whether you freeze. It's whether you can build the specific muscle memory, over time, that lets you move through the freeze faster the next time, and faster still the time after that. That's not talent. That's repetition and deliberate training, and it's exactly what I'm trying to build into this program." "How long did it take you?" Elena asked. "To stop freezing?" "Years," Maya said honestly. "I'm not going to pretend it happened quickly, because that wouldn't be true, and it wouldn't be useful to you either. But it did happen, gradually, through exactly the kind of deliberate scenario training I'm trying to build for this hospital's staff. You froze for a few seconds during an unprecedented crisis. That's not a verdict on your capability. It's information about where your training currently is. And information is something we can actually work with." Elena absorbed this with visible relief. the specific unburdening of someone who had been carrying a harsher verdict on herself than the situation actually warranted. "Thank you," she said. "I needed to hear that framed that way, instead of just as a failure." "It's not a failure," Maya said. "It's a starting point. There's a difference, and I've spent a lot of my own career learning to see it clearly." That evening, reflecting on the conversation with Elena, Maya allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, to think properly about her own early training, the specific, grueling process of building the composure under fire that had, over years, become so thoroughly ingrained that she'd nearly forgotten how deliberately constructed it actually was. She had frozen, during her first genuinely high-stakes deployment, exactly the way Elena had described. A critical few seconds of paralysis during a mass casualty scenario that had, in retrospect, taught her more about her own limitations than any amount of classroom training ever could have. She had spent the following years systematically confronting that specific vulnerability, seeking out training scenarios designed to push her past the freeze response until the response itself had, gradually, restructured into the fast, controlled action that had characterized every subsequent crisis of her career. She thought about the specific officer who had mentored her through that early period, a considerably more experienced coordinator named Commander Patricia Reyes, who had told her, in almost exactly the words Maya had just used with Elena, that freezing wasn't a verdict on capability, but information about where her training currently stood. Reyes had retired 3 years before Maya's own separation, and Maya had lost touch with her in the specific, quiet way that happened to even meaningful relationships once someone left active service. She found herself, that evening, drafting a message to Reyes for the first time in over 2 years, updating her on the disaster response, on the strange, unexpected way her old life had collided with her new one, on the specific satisfaction of finally getting to pass along exactly the kind of mentorship that had once been given to her. Reyes replied within hours, warm and genuinely pleased, and the exchange left Maya with a specific, settled sense of continuity she hadn't fully realized she'd been missing. The recognition that the work she'd once done, and the work she was doing now, were not actually as separate as she'd spent 18 months believing they needed to be. 6 weeks after the hurricane, Harborview faced an unrelated but equally serious test of Maya's newly formalized disaster response role, a chemical leak at an industrial facility 12 miles from the hospital, releasing a toxic gas cloud that drifted, over several hours, toward a residential area home to nearly 3,000 people, triggering a mandatory evacuation that sent a considerable portion of that population toward Harborview's emergency department for evaluation and treatment of exposure symptoms. Among the evacuees was a young father named Marcus Delaney, who arrived at Harborview with his 2 children, both under the age of 6, all 3 presenting with mild initial symptoms that, under the hospital's old protocol, would likely have been triaged well behind the more visibly severe cases flooding in simultaneously. Elena, working the secondary triage point Maya had established as part of the restructured framework, recognized a subtle pattern in the children's presentation, a specific combination of symptoms that suggested a delayed onset complication the training program had specifically prepared her to identify, and escalated their priority accordingly, a decision that proved, within the following hour, to have likely prevented a considerably more dangerous outcome for both children. Marcus found Maya later that day, once his children had been stabilized and cleared for discharge, wanting specifically to thank whoever had trained the nurse who had caught what he later learned could have become a genuinely life-threatening complication if left untreated for even a few more hours. "She said she learned to catch that pattern from you," Marcus told Maya. "I wanted you to know what that training actually did today, not in the abstract, in my kids specifically." Maya felt the particular, grounding satisfaction of hearing her work's impact made concrete and personal, rather than remaining an abstract institutional metric. "I'm glad she caught it," she said. That's exactly the kind of outcome the training program was built to produce. Maya activated the hospital's newly restructured disaster protocol the moment the evacuation order came through. And the difference between this response and the chaotic early hours of the hurricane 6 weeks earlier was, to everyone who had witnessed both events, immediately and strikingly apparent. A coordinated, efficient surge management system that absorbed the sudden influx of exposure patients without the bottlenecks and confusion that had nearly overwhelmed the hospital's original protocol during the storm. Randall Ashcroft worked directly under Maya's command structure this time, not as a reluctant subordinate, but as a genuine, collaborative partner. His clinical expertise integrated seamlessly into the coordination framework Maya had built specifically to make use of exactly that kind of specialized knowledge. "Your surge model's holding," he told her, roughly 2 hours into the response, something like genuine admiration threading through his voice. "I've been running incident command in some form for 11 years, and I've never seen a chemical exposure surge handled with this little strain on staff or resources." "It's not just my model," Maya said. "It's the training we've built into the staff over the last 6 weeks. Elena caught a subtle presentation of delayed onset symptoms in triage 20 minutes ago that could have easily been missed under the old protocol's pace. That's not my doing directly. That's the training program actually working." "You built that program," Ashcroft said. "The credit's still yours, whatever the specific mechanism." "I'd rather share it," Maya said. "Credit that stays isolated to one person doesn't actually make an institution more resilient. Credit that spreads across a trained staff does." It was, in its own understated way, exactly the philosophy that had come to define Maya's expanded role at Harborview over the preceding 6 weeks. Not simply serving as an exceptional individual asset during crises, but systematically building the kind of distributed competence that would make the hospital genuinely resilient, regardless of whether she personally happened to be present when the next disaster struck. The chemical leak response concluded 4 hours after activation, with 0 critical outcomes among the exposed population and a hospital-wide efficiency that regional emergency management would later cite, in a formal review, as a model for other facilities in the area to study and replicate. 3 months after the hurricane, Rear Admiral Delacroix returned to Harborview Regional, this time with advance notice and a formal delegation, for a ceremony that Maya had initially resisted and eventually, at Delacroix's gentle but persistent urging, agreed to attend, understanding, by that point, that some forms of public recognition mattered less for her own sake than for the institutional message they sent about the value of the kind of expertise she'd spent years building. The ceremony took place in Harborview's largest conference room, the same space that had served as the disaster command center during both the hurricane and the chemical leak, reconfigured for the occasion with rows of chairs that filled well past the room's usual capacity for internal events. Nearly the entire nursing staff attended, along with department heads, hospital administration, and a considerable contingent of regional emergency management officials who had, in the months since the hurricane, become genuinely invested in understanding exactly how Harborview had managed such an unusually effective disaster response. Randall Ashcroft sat near the front, no longer in the position of unquestioned authority he'd once occupied without examination, but in something that had, over 3 months of genuine collaborative work, evolved into a considerably more balanced professional partnership. Elena Vasquez sat several rows back, having grown, under Maya's mentorship, into one of the hospital's most confident junior staff members, entrusted with meaningful responsibility during both the chemical leak response and several smaller emergencies in the intervening weeks. Rear Admiral Delacroix stood at the front of the room in formal dress uniform, and he spoke for nearly 20 minutes, first about the specific, sustained value of Maya's restructured disaster response framework, citing both the hurricane and the chemical leak as evidence of a genuinely transformed institutional capability, and then, more personally, about the years of service that had prepared her to build that framework in the first place. Lieutenant Commander Maya Bristol's full service record, he said, previously understated in every civilian context she's operated in since her separation, has been formally reviewed and, effective this week, recognized for purposes of proper accounting by both the Navy and this hospital's administration. I am authorized to inform this room that Lieutenant Commander Bristol is being awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for her sustained contributions to disaster response coordination, both during her active duty service and in the civilian capacity she has built here at Harborview over the past 3 months. He paused, looking directly at Maya. I want to add something not captured in the formal citation, Delacroix continued. When I asked Lieutenant Commander Bristol to take command during the hurricane, I was asking someone who had every reasonable justification to say no, someone who had left active service specifically to escape exactly this kind of high-stakes responsibility, who had built a quiet, deliberately smaller life for herself precisely because the weight of the larger one had become genuinely unsustainable. She said yes anyway because people needed her. And then she spent the following 3 months building something that would outlast her own individual presence. A training program, a distributed system of competence, specifically designed so that this hospital's resilience would never again depend entirely on whether one exceptional person happened to be in the building. That instinct, to build something larger than her own recognition, is worth honoring as clearly as the medal itself. The room absorbed this in the particular silence of people confronting the true scale of what they'd witnessed over the preceding months. Lieutenant Commander Bristol, Delacroix said, please stand. Maya stood. She stood the way she did everything, without performance, without visible ceremony of her own, her straight black hair catching the overhead light, her spine straight, her hands loosely at her sides. The same composed stillness she'd carried through 3 years of quiet civilian shifts, and one extraordinary storm that had, by the end of it, revealed the entire shape of who she actually was. Delacroix crossed the room to her, and the citation he read aloud described, in the careful, formal language of military commendation, actions that everyone in that room had either witnessed directly or heard, recounted so many times over the preceding months that the words carried the specific weight of institutional memory, finally catching up to lived experience. When Delacroix finished, he pinned the medal to Maya's uniform, a formal Navy service uniform delivered quietly 2 days earlier, the first time she'd worn one in over 18 months, and stepped back. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. The specific silence of two people who understood exactly how much distance had been covered between an ordinary Tuesday morning briefing and this room, this moment, this long overdue accounting finally spoken aloud instead of carried quietly in the specific, isolated way competence sometimes went unacknowledged. On behalf of the United States Navy, Delacroix said, his voice carrying the particular formal weight of an official record being spoken into existence. And on behalf of every patient who came through this hospital's doors during the worst of that storm, and made it out the other side because of the framework you built in 90 minutes under active crisis conditions. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. We see you. We have always owed you this recognition. It's overdue. It's here now. Elena Vasquez was the first to start clapping, alone for 1 full second before the rest of the room joined her, the applause building through the space with the specific, cumulative warmth of an entire institution recalibrating all at once its understanding of someone it had genuinely, thoroughly underestimated for 3 quiet years. Maya did not cry, not fully, though something in her composure, watching the room stand, Elena on her feet immediately, Ashcroft rising more slowly but rising nonetheless with genuine respect visible in his expression. The entire assembled staff of a hospital that had spent 3 years walking past her without truly seeing the full shape of who she was. Something in her expression softened, finally, into an emotion she rarely allowed herself in front of an audience. Something that looked, unmistakably, like relief mixed with a specific, hard-won peace. After the ceremony, in the quieter aftermath of a reception the hospital had organized, Randall Ashcroft found her near the window, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the parking lot below with the same unhurried stillness she brought to everything. "I wanted to say something," he said, "that I don't think I managed to say properly 3 months ago." "You don't have to keep apologizing," Maya said, not unkindly. "I told you back then, it's about what you do next, not about saying it enough times." "This isn't only an apology," Ashcroft said. "I wanted to say that watching you work, over these 3 months, differently than I ever let myself watch you before, has been the most instructive thing that's happened to me in 11 years of running incident command. Not the ceremony today, the actual work. The way you've built a system that makes the whole staff more capable, not just yourself. The way you've mentored Elena without ever making her feel small for freezing during her first real crisis. I built an entire career on the assumption that competence needed to announce itself through formal title and years logged, rather than through the actual quality of judgment underneath it. You've spent 3 months proving that assumption wrong in ways I'm going to be unlearning for a long time." Maya considered him for a moment, this man who had publicly dismissed her as just a nurse, and then, 3 months later, stood in front of an entire hospital and admitted, without prompting, exactly how wrong he'd been. "I appreciate that," she said. "And for what it's worth, I've watched the difference too, not just today, in the small, consistent choices over these 3 months. That matters more than any single speech." "Good," Ashcroft said, something like genuine relief moving through his expression. "That was the part I was actually hoping you'd notice. Are you staying at Harborview?" he asked. "Now that everything's different, I know you've had other offers, given how public this has become." Maya looked out the window again, at the parking lot, at the ordinary afternoon light falling across ordinary cars belonging to ordinary people going about their ordinary days, unaware of the extraordinary things that had happened inside the building beside them. "I'm staying," she said. "This is the work I actually want to be doing, not just the crisis response, but the ordinary shifts, the ordinary patients, the actual bedside care that first drew me to nursing in the first place. The disaster response role matters too, and I'm genuinely glad to be building it properly now. But the core of it, the reason I left the Navy to begin with, hasn't changed. I want proximity to the actual patient. That's still true, medal or not." "Good," Ashcroft said. "This hospital's better with you in it, in whatever capacity you choose to occupy. I should have understood that 3 years ago. I understand it now." 6 months after the hurricane, Harborview's disaster response program had grown into something considerably larger than Maya's original, modest proposal. A comprehensive training curriculum that other regional hospitals had begun requesting access to. A formal partnership with the Navy's Coordination Office that gave Harborview early access to emerging best practices in mass casualty management, and a nursing staff that had, collectively, become measurably more confident and capable during high-pressure situations than they had been a year earlier. Maya found, in the months following the ceremony, that her relationship with the work had settled into something she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd first agreed to the expanded role. A specific, sustainable integration of her old expertise and her new civilian life that felt considerably more whole than the careful separation she'd maintained during her first 3 years at Harborview. She was not simply a nurse who happened to have a classified past, nor was she purely the disaster response coordinator her medal and her formal title might have suggested. She was, increasingly, both at once, moving fluidly between bedside patient care and large-scale operational planning in a way that drew on the full range of what she'd spent 15 years learning to do. She maintained regular contact with Commander Patricia Reyes, her old mentor, the two of them exchanging updates and occasional professional advice with a warmth that had, over the months, evolved into something closer to genuine friendship than the formal mentorship relationship that had originally connected them. Reyes visited Harborview once, during a coordination trip along the coast, and spent an afternoon observing one of Maya's training sessions with Elena and several other junior staff, watching with the specific, quiet pride of someone seeing their own mentorship successfully passed forward into a new generation. "You've built something genuinely good here," Reyes told her over coffee after the session concluded. "Not just competent, good, in the way that actually changes how people think about their own capability, long after the specific crisis that revealed it has passed." "I learned that from you," Maya said. "The framing, the specific way of teaching people that freezing isn't a verdict, just information. I've been passing along almost exactly what you taught me, years ago." "That's how the good things actually spread," Reyes said. "Not through grand gestures, through exactly this. One person passing along what mattered to the next person who needs it, consistently, over years." Elena Vasquez, over the following months, continued the specific, steady growth that had characterized her development since the hurricane, eventually taking on a formal role assisting Maya with the hospital's expanding training program, teaching newer staff the same lessons Maya had once taught her, closing a specific loop of mentorship that Maya found, watching it unfold, deeply satisfying in a way that had little to do with her own recognition and everything to do with the broader resilience she'd set out to build. "I used to think competence meant never freezing," Elena told a group of new nursing hires, during one of her own training sessions 6 months after the hurricane, echoing almost exactly the framing Maya had once offered her. "It doesn't. It means building the specific muscle memory that lets you move through the freeze faster, every time, through deliberate practice rather than natural talent. That's not a lesser kind of competence. It's the only kind that's actually sustainable, long-term, under real pressure." Maya, observing from the back of the room, felt something warm move through her chest. The specific, uncomplicated pride of watching a lesson she'd once received herself, from a mentor she still spoke with regularly, continue forward into an entirely new generation of nurses who would likely never fully understand the full chain of mentorship that had shaped the framing they were now receiving as simple, practical wisdom. Randall Ashcroft's transformation over the following months proved, to Maya's cautious but genuine satisfaction, considerably more sustained than the kind of temporary contrition that sometimes followed a single dramatic reckoning. He began, roughly 2 months after the ceremony, quietly restructuring several of his own long-standing assumptions about hospital hierarchy, soliciting input from junior nursing staff during clinical decisions in a way he'd rarely done before, acknowledging publicly when a nurse's observation changed his clinical assessment, and, in a detail that surprised several people who had known him for years, personally recommending 2 other nurses with unconventional employment histories for expanded roles he would once have automatically assumed they weren't qualified for. "I keep catching myself," he admitted to Maya, during one of their now regular collaborative planning sessions, roughly 4 months after the hurricane. "The old instinct, the reflexive assumption based on title rather than demonstrated competence. It hasn't disappeared just because I've built better habits around catching it. That's honest," Maya said. "And it matches something I told you myself, months ago actually. I don't think the instinct fully disappears for most people. I think the goal is building enough awareness that it doesn't get to run the show unchecked. From what I've watched over these months, you've managed exactly that, consistently, even on the days the old instinct tries to reassert itself." "That's a more generous assessment than I probably deserve," Ashcroft said. "It's an accurate one," Maya said. "I don't need you to be perfect for the change to be real, Randall. I need you to be consistently better than you were, and consistently accountable on the days you're not. That's what I've actually watched happen." Ashcroft absorbed this with the particular gravity of someone genuinely moved by an assessment he hadn't fully expected to receive. "Thank you," he said, "for being honest instead of just being kind about it." They're not mutually exclusive, Maya said. Most things people assume are opposites usually aren't, if you look closely enough. The working partnership between Maya and Ashcroft continued to deepen over the following months, evolving from the careful, provisional collaboration of the immediate post-hurricane period into something that had genuinely come to resemble mutual professional respect, and occasionally, in the specific unguarded moments that developed between colleagues who had weathered genuine crisis together, something closer to real friendship. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ashcroft said, during a quiet evening several months after the ceremony, the two of them reviewing updated protocol documents during a rare lull in the hospital's ordinary rhythm. "Something that isn't really about work." "Go ahead," Maya said. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "The years in the Navy, given everything they cost you, given the specific weight you described carrying by the end of it. If you could go back, would you make a different choice?" Maya considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. "No," she said finally. "I regret specific things that happened during those years, the operators I couldn't save, the decisions that cost more than they should have, even when I made every one of them correctly given the information available. But I don't regret the years themselves or the choice to serve in that capacity. I became someone capable of exactly what I did during that hurricane because of those 9 years, not despite them. I don't think I'd trade that capability, even knowing everything it cost me to build it." "That's a generous way to hold something that difficult," Ashcroft said. "It's the only way I've found that actually lets me keep doing the work," Maya said. "Both versions of it, the nursing and whatever this expanded role has become. I needed to make peace with the whole history, not just the parts that were comfortable, before I could actually integrate it into who I am now instead of keeping it carefully hidden." 8 months after the hurricane, Maya received an unexpected visit from someone connected to the mission that had, 18 months before her separation, finally convinced her she needed to leave active duty. A former SEAL operator named Jonah Castellano, one of the 2 survivors of the compound assault that had cost 2 of his teammates their lives. He arrived at Harborview unannounced, having tracked down her current location through informal channels within the Naval Special Warfare community that had, in the months since the hurricane, quietly circulated the story of a former coordinator who had stepped back into command during a civilian disaster and performed, by every account, exactly as exceptionally as she always had. Castellano himself had left active service roughly a year after the mission, his own path shaped by injuries sustained during the assault that had ultimately made continued operational deployment impossible. He now worked in a civilian security consulting role, a transition he described to Maya, during their conversation, as its own difficult process of learning to carry forward skills built for one context into a considerably different one, a parallel Maya recognized immediately, and one that gave their conversation a specific, mutual understanding neither of them needed to explain at length. "I heard what you did here," Castellano said, finding her during a break between shifts, his own bearing carrying the specific, watchful stillness of someone who had spent years in circumstances not unlike Maya's own. "I wanted to see for myself. And honestly, I wanted to thank you properly for something I never got the chance to say clearly enough back then." "You don't owe me anything," Maya said, though something in her posture had gone carefully still, recognizing immediately the specific weight of what this conversation was likely about to become. "I do, actually," Castellano said. "The evacuation plan you built for that mission. It wasn't the reason Delgado and Ruiz died. I know the after-action review confirmed that, but I also know you never fully believed it. Not really. Not underneath the official account. I wanted to tell you myself, as someone who was actually there, that your plan worked exactly as it should have. What killed them wasn't a gap in your planning. It was a tactical variable nobody could have reasonably anticipated, and if your evacuation framework hadn't been as solid as it was, I wouldn't be standing here right now either." Maya felt something in her chest tighten, the specific ache of hearing, finally, directly from someone who had lived through it, the exact confirmation she had spent 18 months, privately, quietly doubting, despite every official assurance to the contrary. "Thank you for telling me that," she said, her voice carrying a rawness that rarely surfaced in front of colleagues, though Castellano, she understood immediately, belonged to a different category entirely. "I needed to hear it directly, from someone who was actually there, more than I probably let myself admit." "I figured," Castellano said. "That's part of why I came in person instead of just sending a message. Some things need to be said face-to-face to actually land." They talked for over an hour, Castellano sharing details of the mission's aftermath that Maya had never had access to through official channels, and Maya, in turn, sharing some of what the following 18 months had actually looked like, the quiet civilian life she'd built, the specific relief and complication of it colliding, unexpectedly, with the hurricane and everything that followed. By the time Castellano left, something in Maya had settled that had remained genuinely unresolved for the better part of 2 years, the particular relief of finally receiving, from exactly the right source, confirmation she hadn't fully realized she'd still been waiting for. That evening, reflecting on the conversation, Maya called Commander Reyes, needing to share the specific weight of what Castellano's visit had meant, with someone who would fully understand its significance, without requiring extensive context. "He came all this way just to tell you that?" Reyes asked, once Maya had recounted the conversation. "He did," Maya said. "I don't think I realized how much I still needed to hear it, honestly, until he actually said the words." "That's how it usually goes," Reyes said. "The things we think we've made peace with often turn out to be waiting for one specific piece of confirmation we didn't know we still needed. I'm glad he found you. Some debts are worth traveling considerable distances to properly settle." "I keep thinking about how differently today would have gone if I'd stayed in the Navy," Maya said. "Whether I'd have ever gotten this conversation, or whether it would have stayed buried in an official record, neither of us ever really talked about directly." "You'll never know the answer to that," Reyes said. "But I think the version of events that actually happened, you building something new, Castellano tracking you down specifically because your civilian story became public enough for him to find you, I think that version carries its own kind of rightness to it. Sometimes the path that looks like a departure from your old life turns out to be exactly what makes the old life's unfinished business finally resolvable." Maya considered this for a long moment, the specific, settled piece of someone finally allowing a difficult chapter of her history to close properly, rather than simply remaining permanently, quietly unresolved. "I think you're right," she said. "I think I needed both halves of this, the Navy years and the civilian life after, to actually get to this specific moment of peace. Neither one alone would have gotten me here." 10 months after the hurricane, Harborview's disaster response framework faced its most severe test yet, a multi-vehicle collision on the interstate highway adjacent to the hospital, involving a passenger bus and several other vehicles, that occurred during evening rush hour and generated a mass casualty event considerably larger and more chaotic than either the hurricane or the chemical leak had produced. The bus had been carrying a youth soccer team returning from a regional tournament, a detail that lent the incident a specific, wrenching emotional weight that rippled through the entire hospital staff the moment word spread of exactly who many of the incoming patients were. Maya, coordinating the response from the command center, made a deliberate point of ensuring the pediatric patients received not just appropriate clinical triage, but also the kind of calm, steady reassurance that mattered enormously to frightened children, separated, in the initial chaos, from their parents and coaches. "I need someone specifically assigned to keeping the kids calm and informed," she told her coordination team, 20 minutes into the response. "Not just clinically triaged, actually reassured. Fear complicates treatment in pediatric patients in ways that pure clinical protocol doesn't always account for." Elena took on that role personally for the first hour, moving between the pediatric patients with a specific warmth that had, over her year of working alongside Maya, become a genuine hallmark of her own emerging leadership style. Competent, thorough, but never losing sight of the specific human fear underneath the clinical presentation. Maya activated the full disaster protocol within 90 seconds of the initial notification, and the response that followed demonstrated, with striking clarity, exactly how thoroughly the hospital's capabilities had been transformed over the preceding 10 months. Elena Vasquez, now a genuinely confident senior nurse in her own right, coordinated the secondary triage point without requiring Maya's direct oversight, executing protocols the two of them had built together with a fluency that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Ashcroft managed the surgical rotation with the same collaborative trust that had come to define his working relationship with Maya, incorporating her logistics assessments into his clinical decisions without any trace of his old reflexive resistance. The collision ultimately produced 31 patients requiring hospital treatment, 12 of them in critical condition, and Harborview's restructured response absorbed the surge without a single treatment delay attributable to systemic bottleneck, a result that stood in such stark contrast to how the hospital's original protocol would likely have handled an equivalent event that it drew formal recognition from the state's emergency management office as a case study for other regional facilities. In the midst of the response, Maya encountered a specific moment that crystallized, for her, exactly how much the hospital's culture had genuinely shifted. A first-year nursing student on clinical rotation, present during the crisis by pure scheduling coincidence, hesitantly offered an observation about a patient's subtle presentation that contradicted the initial assessment of a considerably more experienced physician. The physician, a relatively new hire named Dr. Aisha Bello, who had joined Harborview only months earlier, paused, genuinely considered the student's observation rather than dismissing it, and ultimately incorporated it into a revised assessment that proved, upon further examination, correct. "Where did that habit come from?" Maya asked Dr. Bello afterward, genuinely curious. Taking a first-year student's observation seriously, mid-crisis, without any defensiveness. "Honestly," Dr. Bello said, "I heard the story about what happened here with you and Dr. Ashcroft before I even started this job. It came up during my interview, actually. Someone mentioned it as an example of the hospital's culture. I decided, before I ever set foot in this building, that I wasn't going to be the person who dismissed someone's competence based on their title instead of the actual content of what they were saying." Maya felt something warm and quietly profound move through her chest, the specific, unexpected satisfaction of learning that a single difficult morning, transformed through months of consistent institutional work, had rippled outward into a genuine cultural shift that extended even to staff who had never directly witnessed the original events. "That's exactly what I was hoping this would eventually become," Maya said. "Not just my own competence being recognized, the whole institution actually changing how it evaluates people." "It has," Dr. Bello said simply. "I don't think you fully realize how much, from the inside." Delacroix returned to Harborview twice more over the following year, each visit driven by a combination of genuine coordination business and what had, over time, become something closer to a personal friendship that neither of them had fully anticipated when their paths first reconnected during the hurricane's chaos. During his second visit, roughly a year after the storm, he found Maya during a quiet evening shift, and the two of them ended up talking for nearly 2 hours in the hospital's courtyard. The specific ease of two people who had shared enough consequential history to skip past most of the careful social calibration that typically governed conversations between an admiral and a former subordinate officer. "I've been thinking about something," Delacroix said, partway through the conversation. "A proposal I want to run past you, though I want to be clear up front that I fully expect you to say no, and I won't push if that's your answer." "Go ahead," Maya said. The Navy's building a new advisory program, Delacroix said, specifically designed to help civilian hospitals and emergency management agencies develop disaster response frameworks using military coordination principles, adapted appropriately for civilian contexts. I want you to consider serving as a consulting advisor, not full-time, not requiring you to leave Harborview or step back into active duty in any formal sense, but bringing your specific expertise to bear on a broader scale than just this one hospital. Maya considered this carefully, weighing the specific, complicated calculus of a life she had spent years building around a particular, hard-won equilibrium between her old expertise and her new civilian purpose. I'd want it structured carefully, she said finally. Limited scope, limited time commitment, and absolutely no scenario where it pulls me away from actual bedside patient care for more than a handful of days each quarter. That balance matters enormously to me, and I won't trade it away even for meaningful work. I think that's entirely reasonable, Delacroix said. And frankly, I think your insistence on maintaining that balance is exactly why you'd be valuable in this specific advisory role. Most of the people qualified to build these frameworks left bedside care decades ago and have lost touch with what actually matters at the ground level of patient care. You haven't. That perspective is exactly what this program needs. Maya thought about it for several more days before ultimately agreeing, negotiating the specific terms carefully to ensure the arrangement genuinely protected the balance she'd insisted on. The advisory role, once formalized, brought her into periodic contact with hospitals and emergency agencies across multiple states, each engagement drawing on the same fundamental framework she'd built at Harborview, but adapted to the specific needs and constraints of each new context. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, genuine satisfaction in the work, not the same intensity of purpose that had defined her Navy years, and not quite the same immediate, tangible connection she felt during an ordinary bedside shift, but something that occupied a meaningful middle space between the two versions of purpose she'd spent years learning how to hold simultaneously rather than treating as mutually exclusive. Her relationship with the broader Harborview community continued to deepen over that first year following the hurricane, moving well beyond the specific professional recognition of the ceremony into something considerably more integrated and ordinary. The particular unglamorous texture of simply being a trusted, respected colleague whose history was known but no longer treated as a source of constant fascination or careful navigation. She found herself invited, with increasing regularity, into conversations and decisions that extended well beyond her formal disaster response role. Clinical case discussions where her operational perspective offered genuine value, staffing decisions where her judgment about crisis capacity carried real institutional weight, even occasional social gatherings among the nursing staff that had, during her first 3 years at Harborview, remained carefully distant from her deliberately guarded personal life. She attended one such gathering roughly a year after the hurricane, a modest celebration for a colleague's retirement, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, simply enjoying an ordinary social evening among people who knew the full shape of who she was, and had, over time, simply folded that knowledge into their ordinary understanding of her as a colleague, and, increasingly, a friend. "You seem different tonight," Elena told her, midway through the evening, studying her with the specific perceptiveness that had grown considerably over their months of working together. "More relaxed than I usually see you." "I think I am," Maya said, considering the observation honestly. "I spent a long time keeping careful distance from exactly this kind of ordinary social connection because I wasn't sure how much of myself was actually safe to bring into it. I think I'm finally starting to trust that the answer is considerably more than I used to assume." "I'm glad," Elena said. "You deserve exactly this kind of ordinary evening, after everything." "So do you," Maya said. "You've built something genuinely impressive over this past year, Elena. I hope you know that. beyond just the specific crises we've weathered together. I had a good teacher, Elena said, and there was nothing performative in it, just simple, uncomplicated fact, the kind Maya found she could accept now without the automatic deflection she might have reached for a year earlier. Randall Ashcroft's own history, which Maya learned in careful pieces over the following months of genuine collaborative friendship, offered her a considerably more complete understanding of exactly why his initial reflexive dismissal had run so deep, and why his subsequent transformation, once it began, had proven so genuinely sustained rather than merely performative. He had trained, early in his career, under an attending physician whose management style had been built almost entirely around rigid hierarchy and public correction, a man who had made junior doctors and nurses alike feel, consistently, that competence needed to be proven repeatedly rather than simply trusted once demonstrated. Ashcroft had spent years quietly resenting that treatment, promising himself he would never replicate it, and had, in the specific way people sometimes do without fully recognizing the pattern, become a gentler but structurally similar version of exactly that same rigid hierarchy anyway. Convinced, the entire time, that his own version was different, more justified, more directly connected to patient safety than his old mentor's harshness had ever genuinely been. "I used to think I was protecting patients by being strict about credentials," he told Maya, during one of their now regular evening conversations, several months after the ceremony. "I've come to understand, slowly, that I was actually protecting my own sense of authority, and telling myself a story about patient safety to make that protection feel more justified than it actually was." "That's a difficult thing to recognize about yourself," Maya said. "It took watching you build something genuinely better than what I'd spent 11 years defending," Ashcroft said. "I don't think I would have gotten there on my own, honestly. I needed the specific, undeniable evidence of watching my own protocol fail in exactly the way you predicted, and watching your alternative succeed in exactly the way you designed it to. Abstract arguments about bias and hierarchy probably wouldn't have moved me. Concrete, undeniable results did." "I think that's true for a lot of people," Maya said. "I don't think most institutional change happens through people simply being convinced by better arguments. It happens through people encountering evidence specific and undeniable enough that their old assumptions simply can't survive contact with it." "Is that discouraging?" Ashcroft asked. "That it takes something that dramatic to actually shift deeply held assumptions?" Maya considered this for a long moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I'd prefer a version of institutional change that didn't require an actual hurricane to force the issue. But I've also learned, over years of watching how slowly most meaningful change actually happens, that I'd rather take the change however it genuinely arrives than hold out for some cleaner, more reasonable version that might never actually materialize." Maya's own daily rhythm at Harborview, over that first year following the hurricane, settled into a pattern that felt, to her, considerably more integrated and sustainable than the careful separation she'd maintained during her first 3 years at the hospital. She still woke early, still ran along the waterfront most mornings, still maintained the specific, deliberate discipline that had characterized her entire adult life. But the careful distance she'd once kept from colleagues, the deliberate vagueness about her history, the constant low-grade vigilance about which version of herself was safe to bring into any given room, all of that had, gradually, given way to something considerably more whole. She found herself, on quiet mornings before her shift, occasionally reflecting on the specific journey that had brought her to this particular equilibrium. 9 years of Navy service that had built extraordinary capability at genuine personal cost. 18 months of careful civilian anonymity that had offered real but incomplete peace, and then the hurricane that had, in the space of a single chaotic morning, forced her to finally integrate both halves of who she was, rather than keeping them permanently, artificially separate. She did not know, on any given morning, exactly what the day would ask of her, whether it would be an ordinary shift of bedside patient care, a training session with Elena and the newer nursing staff, an advisory call with a hospital states away seeking guidance on their own disaster response framework, or, occasionally, the specific demand of an actual crisis requiring every ounce of expertise she'd spent 15 years building. She found, increasingly, that she no longer needed to know in advance. She had built, finally, a version of herself capable of meeting whatever the day actually required, without needing to keep any part of that capability carefully hidden from the people around her. 14 months after the hurricane, Harborview hosted a regional emergency management conference, drawing representatives from hospitals and emergency services across the state to study the disaster response framework that had, by that point, become something of a model case within the broader field. Maya presented the core elements of her training program to a room of considerably more experienced emergency management professionals, many of whom had spent decades in the field and carried, in certain unguarded moments, a visible skepticism about what a hospital nurse, however decorated, could genuinely teach them about disaster coordination at scale. She addressed that skepticism directly, early in her presentation, rather than allowing it to remain an unspoken undercurrent throughout the session. I understand some of you are wondering what a civilian hospital's nursing staff can teach a room full of experienced emergency management professionals, she said, scanning the room with the same steady, unflinching directness that had once unsettled colleagues who expected visible strain during a crisis. I'd ask you to consider that the framework I'm about to walk you through wasn't built by a civilian nurse working from theory. It was built by someone who spent 5 years coordinating medical logistics for naval special warfare, adapted specifically for civilian hospital contexts, because I believed, and continue to believe, that the fundamental principles of effective crisis coordination don't actually change much based on whether the crisis is a combat operation or a hurricane. What changes is the specific operational context, not the underlying logic of how to build a system that holds under maximum strain. The room's skepticism, by the end of her presentation, had largely given way to genuine engagement, a shift Maya had witnessed enough times over the preceding year to recognize as a familiar, satisfying pattern, the specific transition from doubt to respect that happened reliably once people encountered the actual substance of her expertise, rather than simply their initial assumptions about a nurse's presumed limitations. Several attendees stayed well past the session's scheduled end time, asking detailed follow-up questions about specific implementation challenges their own institutions had faced, and Maya found herself, for nearly an hour afterward, sketching out preliminary solutions on a conference room whiteboard with the same focused, collaborative energy she brought to her ordinary training sessions with Elena back at Harborview. The specific satisfaction of watching expertise translate into genuine, practical value for people who would carry it forward into their own institutions. A senior emergency management director from a neighboring state approached her after the session, genuinely impressed. I came in expecting a fairly basic overview, he admitted. I'm leaving with 3 specific changes I want to implement in our own framework by next quarter. That's not something that happens often at these conferences, frankly. I appreciate you saying that, Maya said. And I'd be glad to consult further if it would help your team implement those changes properly, rather than just conceptually. I may take you up on that, he said, assuming your schedule allows for it, given everything else you're apparently managing these days. I've gotten fairly good at managing multiple things simultaneously, Maya said, with the specific, understated dryness that had, over the preceding year, become one of the small pleasures of colleagues who'd come to know her well enough to appreciate her particular sense of humor. It's sort of become a defining feature of the last year and a half. Randall Ashcroft attended the conference alongside her, presenting jointly on the specific integration of clinical expertise into the coordination framework Maya had built. A partnership that had, over the preceding year, become genuinely equal in a way that would have seemed entirely unimaginable to anyone who had witnessed his dismissal of her 14 months earlier. It's strange, he told her, during a break between sessions, presenting alongside you like this. I keep thinking about that first briefing, and how differently everything could have gone if Admiral Delacroix hadn't walked in when he did. Do you think you'd have eventually recognized it on your own? Maya asked, without the specific, forced reckoning of that particular morning. Ashcroft considered the question with genuine, extended thought, rather than a quick, easy answer. I honestly don't know, he said finally. I'd like to believe I would have, eventually. But I think the honest answer is that I might have gone considerably longer without ever fully examining the pattern if circumstances hadn't forced the issue quite so directly and publicly. That's not a comfortable thing to admit, but I think it's true. I appreciate the honesty, Maya said. I think most meaningful change probably works that way, for most people. It's rarely a gradual, gentle process of self-examination. It's usually something considerably more forced and uncomfortable than that, even when the eventual result turns out to be genuinely good. I'm glad the forced version happened, Ashcroft said. Even though I wish it hadn't required you carrying the weight of my initial mistake to get there. I've made my peace with how it happened, Maya said. I'd rather focus on what came after. That's the part that actually determines whether the whole thing mattered. 18 months after the hurricane, exactly as long as she had spent building her careful civilian anonymity before the storm forced everything into the open, Maya received a letter from Delgado's family, the operator who had died during the compound assault that had ultimately driven her separation from active duty. The letter had been prompted by Castellano, who had, in the months following his own visit to Harborview, quietly shared Maya's story with several other members of the broader naval special warfare community, including, eventually, Delgado's widow. The letter was brief, warm, and carried a specific, generous grace that moved Maya considerably more than she'd expected. Delgado's widow wrote that she had read about the hurricane response, about Maya's return to a form of the work that had once cost her so much, and wanted her to know that the family held no resentment toward the medical planning that had, in the end, done everything reasonably possible to protect her husband during an operation that ultimately went wrong for reasons entirely outside anyone's control. I wanted you to know, the letter read, that we've always understood the difference between an unavoidable tragedy and a preventable failure. You gave my husband every reasonable chance the mission's circumstances allowed. I'm glad to hear you found a way to keep doing this kind of work, in whatever form it takes now. I think he would have wanted that for you, if he'd had any say in it. Maya read the letter alone in her apartment, and found herself, for the second time in 18 months, genuinely moved to tears by an unexpected piece of grace from someone who had every reason to hold more complicated feelings toward her. She wrote back carefully, over several days, sharing what she could about the mission's actual circumstances, about the specific weight she had carried in the years since, and about the strange, unexpected way a hurricane had eventually helped her find a version of peace she hadn't fully believed was still available to her. The correspondence that followed, sporadic but genuine, became one more thread in the broader tapestry of resolution that the preceding 18 months had gradually woven together. Castellano's visit, Delgado's widow's letter, the specific, cumulative process of finally, properly closing a chapter of her history that she had spent considerable time believing would simply remain permanently, quietly unresolved. Maya found, in the months following that correspondence, a specific, unexpected lightness in her ordinary daily work that she hadn't fully anticipated. The particular relief of no longer carrying an unresolved question underneath every routine shift, every training session, every moment of quiet reflection about the specific path that had brought her to Harborview. She had spent 18 months building a life that worked, despite that unresolved weight. She discovered, once it finally lifted, how much lighter the same life felt without it. A difference she hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. She shared this specific realization with Elena during one of their regular mentoring conversations, offering it as one more piece of the broader lesson she'd been trying to teach, that competence and healing weren't separate achievements requiring separate kinds of work, but were, in practice, deeply intertwined processes that supported and reinforced each other over time. "I used to think I needed to fully heal before I could do this work well," Maya told her. It turns out the reverse was equally true. Doing the work well, consistently, over time, was itself part of how the healing actually happened. "I don't think I would have gotten to the peace I have now if I'd waited for the peace to arrive first, before letting myself do the work that mattered." "That's a specific kind of wisdom," Elena said. "I don't think you get to that understanding quickly." "No," Maya agreed. "It took years. But I think that's true of most things that end up actually mattering." On a quiet Tuesday morning, 18 months after Randall Ashcroft had told an entire command center that she was just a nurse and ordered her removed from a briefing where her assessment would prove critical to preventing catastrophic outcomes, Maya Bristol walked into Harborview Regional Medical Center at the start of her shift, checked her assignments, and began, once again, the quiet, essential work that had always been the truest core of who she was, regardless of whatever additional responsibilities and recognition had accumulated around it over the preceding year and a half. Her first patient that morning was an elderly woman admitted overnight with a suspected cardiac event, frightened in the particular quiet way elderly patients often were. Maya sat with her for a few extra minutes before her rounds officially required her elsewhere, answering questions patiently, adjusting her blanket, offering the same steady, unhurried reassurance she brought to every frightened patient, whether they were an ordinary cardiac case or one of the critical casualties from the hurricane's worst hours 18 months earlier. It did not matter to her, in the end, which kind of patient was in front of her, or which version of her expertise a given day happened to require. That had never been the point. The point had always been showing up, paying attention, doing the work in front of her with the full weight of everything she'd learned across 15 years and two entirely different but equally genuine versions of medical service. Randall Ashcroft passed her in the hallway on his way to a morning consult, and instead of the reflexive dismissiveness that had once characterized nearly every interaction between them, he simply nodded, a small, genuine acknowledgement between colleagues and, increasingly, friends who had weathered something significant together and come out the other side with a considerably more honest understanding of each other. "Morning, Lieutenant Commander," he said, and the title, which had once landed in that hospital's command center like a detonation, now carried nothing more than simple, settled fact. The way a rank settles into a place once everyone in the building has finally, fully understood what it actually represents. "Morning, Randall," Maya said, using his first name with the specific ease of genuine friendship rather than formal professional distance, and continued down the hall toward her first patient of the day, her black hair catching the fluorescent light, her pace unhurried, her attention already, entirely, on the work in front of her. She thought, sometimes, on quiet mornings like this one, about the specific arc that had brought her to exactly this point. 9 years of Navy service that had cost her more than she'd fully understood at the time. 18 months of careful civilian anonymity that had offered real but incomplete peace. And then a hurricane that had forced her, in the space of a single chaotic morning, to finally stop keeping the two halves of her history artificially separate. She thought about Delgado and Ruiz, about the specific weight of a mission that had never been her fault but that she had carried, for years, as though it might have been. She thought about Castellano's unexpected visit, about Delgado's widow's generous letter, about the slow, cumulative process of finally receiving confirmation, from exactly the right sources, that she had done everything reasonably possible during a mission that had gone wrong, for reasons entirely outside her control. She thought about Elena, who had grown, under her mentorship, into a genuinely confident senior nurse capable of coordinating complex crises without requiring Maya's direct oversight. A specific kind of legacy that mattered to Maya considerably more than any medal or formal recognition. The particular satisfaction of watching competence and confidence spread outward from a single difficult morning into something that would likely outlast her own individual presence at Harborview by decades. She thought about Randall Ashcroft, about the specific, sustained work of genuine institutional change, about how rarely such change happened easily or gracefully, and about how genuinely proud she'd become, over 18 months of watching him work, of a colleague who had faced the full weight of his own worst professional moment and chosen, consistently, to become someone measurably better in its aftermath. She was not, in the end, a legend, whatever the hospital's ongoing institutional memory had eventually made of her story in the year and a half since the hurricane. She was a nurse, and, increasingly, something more than that, a coordinator and mentor and advisor whose expertise now extended well beyond Harborview's walls. But underneath every additional title and every accumulated responsibility, she remained, fundamentally, exactly what she had always been, someone who believed, without complication, that the person in front of her mattered, that their survival was worth whatever it cost her personally to secure it, and that this commitment had never once required anyone else's permission or anyone else's belief in her competence to be genuinely permanently true. Randall Ashcroft understood that now, in a way he hadn't 18 months earlier, when he'd looked at a quiet, unassuming nurse with jet-black hair and steady, unblinking eyes, and decided, without ever actually examining the assumption, that she was simply just a nurse, unqualified to be in a room where consequential decisions were being made. He understood, watching her walk down that hallway on an ordinary Tuesday morning, exactly how much he had missed during those first 3 years, and exactly how much he still had left to learn from a woman who had never once needed his approval, or anyone else's, to know precisely who she was. Somewhere in a formal Navy record that captured only a fraction of the full weight of what she'd actually done across 15 years of service in 2 entirely different but equally genuine capacities, the citation for her meritorious service medal sat quietly alongside a considerably longer, mostly unwritten history. The mission that had cost her Delgado and Ruiz, the years of careful civilian rebuilding that followed, the single extraordinary morning that had forced everything back into the open, and the 18 months since that had, patiently, deliberately, woven both halves of her history into something considerably more whole than either version alone had ever managed to be. No single document would ever capture the entirety of who Maya Bristol actually was. No document ever could. But the people who had watched her walk back into that command center, take command of a crisis nobody else in the room was fully equipped to manage, and then spend the following 18 months building something that would outlast her own individual presence, they knew. They would carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their careers. The specific, permanent understanding that competence rarely announces itself through title or credential alone. That the quietest, most unassuming person in the room is sometimes exactly the person capable of holding everyone else steady when the crisis finally arrives, and that the words, "just a nurse," would never again, in that hospital, be spoken by anyone who had actually taken the time to watch her work.